This is Land of Havilah, Isaiah 10. The chapter break doesn't mean anything at all because Yahweh continues exactly where he left off in chapter 9. He was saying all Israel are devouring themselves with evil, and he'll cut them off. By way of how he'll do that, he's already said the Assyrians will invade, overwhelm Israel, and in Judah they'll flood the land up to the neck. Now Yahweh continues about Israel and Judah, verse 1. Woe to those who decree unrighteous decrees, and to the writers who write oppressive decrees, to deprive the needy from justice, and to rob the poor among my people of their rights, that widows may be their plunder, and that they may make the fatherless their prey. What will you do in the day of visitation, and in the desolation which will come from afar? To whom will you flee for help? Where will you leave your wealth? They'll only bow down under the prisoners and will fall under the slain. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. Comment in verses 1 to 4, the rulers and judges of the land are corrupt. They should be looking out for the vulnerable among them, the needy, the poor, the widows, and the fatherless. But they prey on them instead. They deprive them of justice. And verse 3, what will they do when Yahweh visits them with retribution? In verse 4, they'll have no option but to die by the sword in the invasion. And if they don't die, be taken prisoner. They'll kneel among the captives. High-ranking men will kneel as captives and be carried away to slavery. But for all that, Yahweh's anger won't be turned away. His hand will be stretched out against them still. Verse 5. Alas, Assyrian, the rod of my anger, the staff in whose hand is my indignation, I'll send him against a profane nation and against the people who anger me. I'll give him a command to take the plunder and to take the prey and to tread them down like mire in the streets. However, he doesn't mean so, neither does his heart think so, but it's in his heart to destroy and to cut off not a few nations. Comment in verses 5 to 7, Yahweh addresses the Assyrians who will invade. In effect, he says, woe to you, Assyria. Yes, you'll be my instrument of anger against Israel and Judah. I'm sending you against them because they're profane and they anger me. I'm commanding you to attack them, to take plunder, to take prey, and trample them like mire in the streets. But you're unaware that your power is thanks to me. All you know is that it's in your heart to destroy many nations. You don't know or consider why it's in your heart, or where you got the strength to do it. You imagine you're strong and aggressive by some credit of your own. Still speaking of Assyria, Yahweh says, verse 8, for he says, aren't all of my princes kings? Isn't Calno like Carchemish? Isn't Hamath like Arpad? Isn't Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has found the kingdoms of the idols, whose engraved images exceeded those of Jerusalem and of Samaria, shall I not, as I've done to Samaria and her idols, so do to Jerusalem and her idols? Comment, Assyria's attitude in verses 8 to 11 is prideful. In their lofty thinking, each of their princes is equivalent to a king. They've been able to destroy every nation and principal city in their path, such as Calno, Carchemish, Hamath, Arpad, Samaria, and Damascus. And because of that unbroken string of victories, they assume they can keep rolling through Judah and Jerusalem. They've been able to destroy the gods and idols of all those places, and they'll do the same to the gods and idols of Israel and Judah. Even they'll do it to Yahweh. Verse 12. Therefore it will happen that when the Lord has performed his whole work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, I'll punish the fruit of the willful, proud heart of the king of Assyria and the insolence of his arrogant looks. For he has said, by the strength of my hand I have done it, and by my wisdom, for I have understanding, and I have removed the boundaries of the peoples, and have robbed their treasures. Like a valiant man I have brought down their rulers. My hand has found the riches of the peoples like a nest, and like one gathers eggs that are abandoned, I've gathered all the earth. There was no one who moved their wing, or that opened their mouth, or chirped. Comment in verses 12 to 14, Yahweh says, when he has performed his whole work on Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he'll punish the king of Assyria. It turns out that the whole work of Yahweh was the national recovery in Judah, led by King Hezekiah, 2 Kings 18. In the midst of that revival, the Assyrian king invaded, but Yahweh resisted him. 185,000 of the Assyrian soldiers simply died in their campsites, 2 Kings 19:35. They went to bed in their tents and didn't wake up the next morning. The king of Assyria knew Yahweh did it, and that he had no choice but to withdraw, 2 Kings 18 and 19. That was the punishing of the willful, proud heart of the king of Assyria mentioned in verse 12. And after the king of Assyria got home, Yahweh punished him further by killing him, 2 Kings 19:37. It was because of his insolence against Yahweh and arrogant looks in verse 12, and because he said, "By my own strength I've conquered all the nations, and by my wisdom and understanding I've erased their boundaries, robbed their treasuries, defeated their rulers, found their riches, and taken them as easily as robbing an undefended bird's nest. None of the nations so much as chirped against me or batted their wings at me because of my strength," is what he said. Continuing about Yahweh's judgment against Assyria, Yahweh says, verse 15, "Should an axe brag against him who chops with it? Should a saw exalt itself above him who saws with it? As if a rod should lift those who lift it up, or as if a staff should lift up someone who's not wood? Therefore the Lord Yahweh of armies will send among his fat ones leanness, and under his glory a burning will be kindled like the burning of a fire. The light of Israel will be for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and his briars in one day. He will consume the glory of his forest and of his fruitful field, both soul and body. It will be as when a standard-bearer faints. The remnant of the trees of his forest shall be few, so that a child could write their number." Comment in verse 15, "The king of Assyria is like a dumb axe that assumes it swings itself." The king gives no thought to the fact that Yahweh does the swinging, and he's only the instrument. He's only an axe or rod or staff being swung by, quote, "someone who is not wood," end quote. The point being that Yahweh isn't an idol of wood, that Yahweh's doing the swinging, and the king of Assyria is only an instrument. In verse 16, Yahweh is Lord of armies. That's more traditionally translated Lord of hosts, but that wording doesn't convey the military aspect of it in Hebrew, that Yahweh is in command of armies of angels, hosts of angels. Jesus said he could call down more than 12 legions of angels on a moment's notice, Matthew 26:53. The king of Assyria would be no match for that. "Please give me a break with all your arrogance," Yahweh says. In verse 16, Yahweh says he'll send leanness among the Assyrian king's fat ones, meaning he'll humble all the pride of the Assyrians. Yahweh will kindle a fire under the Assyrian glory. He'll burn up their glory. In verse 17, Yahweh is the light of Israel and the holy flame that does the burning. He'll devour the thorns and briars of Assyria in one day. It puts them in their place to call them briars and thorns. In verse 18, Yahweh will consume the glory of Assyria's forest, his fruitful field, both soul and body, as when the standard-bearer faints. The standard-bearer carries the flag of a country. When he faints in battle, the flag falls. The national strength and pride of Assyria shall fall. In verse 19, the remnant of the trees will be so few that a child could write their number. There won't be much left of the empire to brag about. Coming up in the rest of this chapter, despite the coming invasion and displacement of Israel and devastation of Judah, God will preserve a small remnant, and in the next chapter, though they're scattered all over all the earth, Yahweh will regather them under the Messiah. Verse 20. It will come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and those who have escaped from the house of Jacob will no more again lean on him who struck them, but shall lean on Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. A remnant will return, even the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people Israel are like the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness. For the Lord Yahweh of armies will make a full end, and that determined throughout all the earth. Therefore the Lord Yahweh of armies says, "My people who dwell in Zion, don't be afraid of the Assyrian, though he strike you with the rod and lift up his staff against you, as Egypt did. For yet a very little while, and the indignation against you will be accomplished, and my anger will be directed to his destruction. Yahweh of armies will stir up a scourge against him, as in the slaughter of Midian at the rock of Oreb. His rod will be over the sea, and he'll lift it up like he did against Egypt." Comment: Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 summarize Yahweh's covenant with Israel. He said he would bless them for obedience and curse them for disobedience. He said his curses on them, which he knew would fall on them through the ages, would serve as a sign and wonder that he remembers what he originally told them and that he continues to perform his word to them, Deuteronomy 28:46. Just as he blessed them mightily by bringing them into the promised land, he'll curse them mightily and scatter them from the land if they forsake him, Deuteronomy 28:64. As a last resort, Yahweh will scatter them among the nations. Yet for all the curses Yahweh might bring on them, he'll not utterly reject them. He'll remember the covenant he made with them when he brought them out of Egypt, Leviticus 26:44 and 45. The covenant was that he would deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey, Exodus 3:8. So Yahweh will never give up on them totally. He'll put them in the land forever. In verses 20 to 26 of Isaiah 9 we just read, Yahweh hasn't forgotten anything of what he said. Though he displaces Israel to foreign lands, namely into various parts of the Assyrian Empire in this case, he'll eventually follow through with his promise to deliver them from the nations again and regather a faithful remnant to the promised land, because the land was exactly that. It was promised. He promised he wouldn't utterly forsake them. In verse 20, Israelites who escape the coming woes of the Assyrian invasion will lean no more on him who struck them, meaning they'll no more depend on their captors for sustenance. They'll come to depend on Yahweh, as they should. In verse 21, a remnant will return to the mighty God. In verse 22, that remnant he speaks of will be a small fraction of what they used to be. They were a people as numerous as the sand of the sea, but Yahweh has determined destruction for a great number of them. He'll perform that destruction in righteousness. If he destroys, it's an overflowing of righteousness, not of evil. In verse 23, Yahweh will make a full end throughout the earth. He'll make a full end of unrighteousness. Therefore, in verse 24, for all who dwell in Zion, which means for all who dwell in Yahweh, don't be afraid of the Assyrian, though they strike you as the Egyptians used to strike you. The experience of being captive in Assyrian lands will be similar to when they were slaves in Egypt, but don't be afraid, because in verse 25, my indignation against you will soon run its course. In verse 26, it won't be long until Yahweh stirs up a scourge against the oppressor, as he slaughtered the oppressive Midianites at the rock of Oreb, Judges 7:25. Yahweh will stretch his rod over the situation as when Moses stretched his rod over the Red Sea, Exodus 14:16. Yahweh will command Israel's deliverance once again, in other words. Now, rounding out the chapter, speaking the entire way through of Yahweh's deliverance, verse 27, it will happen in that day that his burden will depart from off your shoulder, and his yoke from off your neck, and the yoke shall be destroyed because of the anointing oil. He has come to Aath. He has passed through Migron. At Michmash he stores his baggage. They've gone over the pass. They've taken up their lodging at Geba. Ramah trembles. Gibeah of Saul has fled. Cry aloud with your voice, daughter of Galim. Listen, Laisha, you poor Anathoth. Madmenah is a fugitive. The inhabitants of Gebim flee for safety. This very day he'll halt at Nob. He shakes his hand at the mountain of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. Behold, the Lord, Yahweh of armies, will lop the boughs with terror. The tall will be cut down, and the lofty will be brought low. He'll cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. Comment in verse 27, for those who lean on Yahweh in truth, the burden of the oppressor will fall from their neck. The yoke of bondage will drop off. Then in verses 28 and 29, there's a list of geographical locations, all within a hair's breadth of Jerusalem, that the Assyrians will descend upon. Simultaneously, each place is a place where Yahweh gave Israel miraculous victory in the past. So it's a prediction that the Assyrian army will advance to the doorstep of Jerusalem, but through a miracle Yahweh will give victory. Specifically, Aath is Ai, where Yahweh gave victory in Joshua 8. Then Migron, Michmash, the pass, Geba, Ramah, and Gibeah are all part of the story of 1 Samuel 14 and 15, where Yahweh miraculously expelled the Philistines. That was when Jonathan and his armor-bearer climbed the cliff and put the Philistine camp to flight. Yahweh's deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrians will be just that miraculous. Laish and Galim in verse 30 are a little different. They're within 3 and 13 miles of Jerusalem, respectively. They're mentioned in 1 Samuel 25:44. In that verse, Saul took his daughter Michal from David, and gave her to another man. So by that reference, Yahweh knows Assyria will try to take his beloved Jerusalem away from him, but he will not let it happen. In verse 31, the significance of Madmenah and Gebim and their locations are undiscoverable to your narrator. In verse 32, Nob was 1 or 2 miles from Jerusalem, and in Saul's time it was famous as the home of the priesthood. Saul ordered all the priests there to be slaughtered, 1 Samuel 22. Yahweh says in verse 32 that the Assyrians, quote, will halt at Nob. In other words, he won't let the Assyrians destroy the priesthood, as happened in the days of Saul, which is what would have happened if he had let the Assyrians into Jerusalem. In verse 32, the king of Assyria shakes his hand at the mountain of the daughter of Zion, which means he'll threaten Yahweh's beloved Jerusalem. This came to pass in 2 Kings chapter 18, the events of which were about 30 years in the future when Isaiah predicted them here. In verses 33 to 34, Yahweh will cut off the Assyrians like lopping boughs off a tree, in a way that terrorizes them. He'll cut them down. The lofty will be brought low. The Assyrians are a mighty forest, but Yahweh cuts them down with iron. Lebanon will fall by the mighty one. History tells us that the Assyrians defeated Tyre in 701 BC and Sidon in 677, which are the area of Lebanon. But as Yahweh already said, he was the strength and aggression behind the Assyrians. So yes, Lebanon fell by the mighty one, as predicted in verse 34, the mighty one being Yahweh, not Assyria. In summary of this chapter, woe to Israel and Judah, especially the northern kingdom, because Assyria will completely conquer them and carry them away captive. Assyria will trample the northern kingdom like mire in the streets. Yahweh will be behind it. And by the way, woe to Assyria as well, because they're arrogant and don't credit Yahweh. They think Yahweh's another wooden god. The time will come that Yahweh will whittle them down to nothing. For all that devastation of the northern kingdom, Yahweh will preserve a remnant that lean on him in truth. A remnant of them will return to the land. We often hear talk of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, which is the northern kingdom, but they're not lost to Yahweh. He knows how to identify them and return the remnant. Yahweh will break the yoke of foreign oppressors off the neck of Israel. And speaking of Judah and Jerusalem, he'll miraculously deliver them from impending disaster at the hands of the Assyrians. This chapter is a mixture of short and long-term prophecies, all holding to the word Yahweh laid out in the law of Moses. That word is forever. Isaiah 11 is next.